This next step, we will look at net zero cities of the future. I have with me Justin, Phill, who is Senior Engineer, Green Building and Energy Code, City of Edmonton. Adam Rysanek, Associate Professor at the UBC School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture. He was actually involved in the tour yesterday as well. And Zahra, who is joining us on stage. And she is with the City of Vancouver, and she acts as an embodied carbon policies and regulation expert. Thank you for joining us. As we think through the net zero transition and we look to net zero cities, can you help to explain what the process was like internal to your city as you were contemplating, should we sign on to be a net zero city? If so, what are the steps that we put in place to help make that happen?
Was addressed to me? Sure. I'll just add a caveat that I work with the sustainability group of the City of Vancouver in the green building team. My focus is on embodied carbon. So I think I'll address those in more detail. But just to give you a big picture, the City of Vancouver has set targets from back in 2007, 10, 15, and we had all these goals of being the greenest city in the world. At some point around 2016, we realized that we are following maybe a wrong measure. We started realizing that the buildings are not reducing their carbon emission in actual performance, even though they're following standards. And it was when we started looking into cities that has done a great job of making that transition. So for example, Brussels was an example, looking into a city that their building wasn't performing so well, and in a matter of a few years, they transitioned and reduced their carbon emissions significantly. So for the City of Vancouver to be able to achieve the climate targets that we're setting, there was no option to not do that. That's a target that is set. That's something that the citizens wanting the city to do. So it was just a matter of how. And the City of Vancouver developed a zero-emission building plan back in 2016, which basically started modeling after successful examples of the cities that have done that. So there are three key factors in that. First is having a very clear destination and path, so signaling where we are going to the industry, so setting stepped GHG reduction targets. So we started looking at the carbon emissions instead of energy, and we set an end target, so 2030 target, 2040 target, and started setting the steps to get there. The second item is identifying, supporting, and learn from the leaders. So there were already buildings that were doing a great job in having zero carbon or very low carbon emissions. So identifying paths to support them, reduce the barriers that might have been in the permitting process, for example. So do whatever possible to support those leaders and then learn from them, and expand those learnings through the code to other buildings. So the third option is building industry and government capacity. So not only our staff needed to know what they're looking at, also the industry. So one example of the kind of support that we did was starting the support of establishing the zero-emission building exchange in Vancouver, which basically is a hub for the industry to learn from each other. Yeah, I think that's like the big picture.
Thank you. Justin, can you walk us through the most critical infrastructure upgrades required to achieve net zero emissions in cities? And how can we ensure they are technologically and financially feasible?
Yeah, thanks. The city of Edmonton, I guess the first piece of infrastructure is actually having a plan to get to net zero. So the city of Edmonton has an energy transition strategy, which has 4 main pillars to it. So the first one that I'm most familiar with, emissions neutral buildings, which I think we all work with day to day to try and make our buildings better and better. But then also looking at ways to reduce our emissions from transportation. So looking at ways to make transit more accessible, improve our bike infrastructure, and those alternative methods of transportation so we're not taking cars around everywhere. And then the other 2 are around resilience and I forget the 4th one. Sorry, it's not my usual go-to. I'm very focused on emissions neutral buildings. So since 2019, that's been kind of my project and my baby throughout my journey at the city so far. We've done a ton of industry engagement around emissions neutral buildings to find out what we need to achieve this goal of an emissions neutral building, new construction by 2030, and then all community-owned buildings and all existing buildings by 2050. And Edmonton's cold. Like it gets down to -30, -35. So it's very challenging in our climate to design a building that can keep the heat on when it's that cold too. And it takes a lot of energy to heat up air from -30 to a comfortable +20, +21 that we have here indoors as well too. So the steps that we've been taking through the industry engagement is we know that we have to switch away from fossil fuel-based systems, which is used in every building in Edmonton. There's always boiler systems and moving more toward things like air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps where it's viable to do so. We've done modelings of various archetypes from our single-family detached homes, row houses, warehouses, commercial retail units, and then high-rise residential and high-rise commercial buildings. And what we see is that we need a really good envelope. We need to reduce the demand in these buildings so that we can keep our peak loads low enough that we can actually use an air source heat pump or a ground source heat pump in our climate, which has a very large heating load. We developed a new sustainable building policy, which is now called the Climate Resilient Policy at the City of Edmonton, that requires all new city-owned buildings to be designed emissions neutral. And the city's portfolio is things from like rec centers, which have huge loads from ice plants and hockey rinks and swimming pools, which is a very challenging archetype to reach emissions neutrality or design to be net zero. And also buildings like LRT maintenance facilities. When we looked at the electrical load in an all-electric system for that, this building almost needed its own substation just because there's so much going on when it comes to outdoor air for maintenance spaces and all that too. So we need to beef up our electrical infrastructure, and we've been talking with the utilities, and they don't have too many concerns. They think they can keep up as we add electrical demand to our grid. And we've been trying to encourage on the smaller end of this, getting 200 amp services and improving that like base electrical capacity of our homes so that we can support things like heat pumps and then also your hot tub and your EV charger and all those things that add to your quality of life as well too. I mean, way back, 60 amp service was standard. Before that, it was probably less than that. But as we keep adding technology, our electrical needs increase as well too. So that 200 amp step is coming, I think, and we need to start thinking about it and how we can make that a reality in our homes.
Thank you. Adam, you get to interact with our next generation of leaders. And we know that students sometimes come up with some of the most innovative and creative ideas that we could possibly imagine. Could you describe a hypothetical net zero city and explain how it differs in terms of architectural features and urban layout from traditional cities?
Yeah, I get a fun question. I'm of two minds of this. I have the pleasure of being a professor in architecture school, but I'm an engineer by training. I worked in consulting and did a full circle to come to an architecture school under the realization that this discipline is still kind of a missing link here with our discussion about decarbonization. They're not as much, despite in fact great leaders that we've heard today, as much at the seat of the table in code and regulatory context the way engineering is regulated around performance. And I actually have two worries. One is in the direction I think we're heading now with future cities around a mix of the confusion or the conflation of net zero carbon with net zero energy. And the idea that we're going to get towards decarbonization with highly energy efficient brand new buildings. And while that sounds fantastic, and the Europeans build some exceptionally beautiful net zero energy buildings, I don't see the labor market in Canada or the capital available to make exceptionally beautiful net zero energy buildings here. And I can speak to a number of which at the affordable level, they look great performatively. But I think for the regular consumer in Canada, we're going to hit a plateau at which net zero energy doesn't look as architecturally appealing. That's one thing if that were to continue. But with what's happening within the cities anyway, within Vancouver and elsewhere, research that we're doing and others are doing within the scientific domain seem to be suggesting that there is a different pathway that will emerge if we're dealing truly with total carbon reduction of the building stock. These are based on two things that are being observed. One is our LCAs for building, although LCA is not a new domain, and we've been establishing kind of ways to estimate embodied carbon of structures and envelope, we're seeing that we're potentially undercounting the true embodied carbon of new buildings, not just by a small amount, but by a substantial amount. And that flips the balance between embodied and operating. And the other side that does it with operating is our grid is, thankfully, getting cleaner than we thought it would. It's in fact one of the few things that seems to be progressing along Paris Climate Accords that we'd hoped for. What I suspect this means, and this is where we are lacking in grand visionary proposals, is if the future means that it's not embodied versus operating so much as it's really about ultra low embodied carbon buildings, where net zero carbon is primarily about embodied and less so about operating. In fact, maybe high energy efficiency is not an asset for decarbonizing a building. That requires a total radical rethink of building typologies. That would, if you take that line forward, that argues that we don't have enough time to wait for low carbon concrete. We're talking about, getting rid of excavation and underfloor parkades, because that's your only asset to try to get to a rapid reduction in carbon emissions. And this is all to say that I actually think in terms of the grand amount of finance and investment we have for policy and incentives for new buildings, probably we're at a time where we should start thinking about not just a parallel openness towards embodied and operating, but to really seek firms and projects that try to come up with radical solutions for ultra low embodied carbon buildings. Because it probably is going to be where the real measurement of zero carbon is going to achieve. I don't see it happening on the operating or energy efficiency side, in the future at least.
Thank you.
Sorry for that.
Oh, it's great. Okay. I heard a little bit of urgency right there, and that this is going to be challenging, and that maybe if we were to take a rapid approach, things would change. So let's say that we decided that we were truly going to do it, right? And that there was absolutely no way out. We had to reduce carbon emissions by 50% by 2030. That's it. We're sitting here in an exercise. We're not leaving the room till we figure it out. What do you think that we need to do over the next year?
I think I'll follow what Adam said. Actually, very great points Adam raised. So in the city of Vancouver, for example, we know that close to 60% of our emissions are from buildings, and 95% of that are from existing buildings. And in new buildings, that they are very well moving toward being zero emissions, we have 95% of the emissions from embodied carbon. So focusing on embodied carbon on new buildings is an absolute necessary step to take. It's a loss of opportunity to not look at it now, especially that we are looking at 2050 target, because materials that go into buildings, their emissions will happen now and not throughout the lifetime of the building, the majority of it at least. So what the city of Vancouver did was back in 2016, when we developed the zero emission building plan, embodied carbon was, at least in North America, something that was more explored in academia or as an optional approach in the buildings. So we started asking, just starting to report embodied carbon from large buildings. So rezoning projects was our start. And now, 7 years after that, just this October, we started reporting embodied carbon on all new Part 3 buildings. And going to 2025, we will start having reduction requirements, 10% all the way to 40%, depending on the building type and other conditions. So I think it's the same approach that we took on operational carbon, having a very clear target to reduce our embodied carbon by 40% by 2030. So that signals the change. And then we start having these targets. We'll start working with the industry to build the capacity. We will do our buildings ahead of the requirements. So now we have committed to 40% reduction of city-owned buildings today. So learning from our own projects is a tool that we always have, and then supporting the industry leaders as always. And through that, we will start building and providing guidelines, education, and the industry will grow much faster. Comparing to how the industry was paying attention to embodied carbon back in 2016 to today, it's a huge change just by starting to take it more seriously and signaling the change that is going to come. And I think the other one is existing buildings. As I said, majority of our building emissions are from existing buildings. They are more costly or sophisticated to decarbonize. So again, similar approach. We will signal the reduction that we are aiming. So we'll have majority of our existing buildings to be zero emission by 2040, but we are starting to take steps, starting by reporting. That's how we always start to understand. So we will start reporting. We will start asking for for operational carbon of existing buildings to be reported starting 2024, next year, and then we'll start having the first limits in 2026. So, and there's multiple ways that these buildings can be decarbonized. And as Adam said, we are lucky to have a clean grid, so fuel switching and without changing the envelope can get us very far to where we want. And older buildings, they may need to change the envelope, and that is going to happen in the renovation cycles. Again, clear target, starting by larger buildings that have more capacity to learn and innovate and be leaders, and then take the learnings from them, including the city buildings, and take the learnings from them to support the rest of the industry to achieve the targets that we are setting.
Yeah, if we had to do this in a year, I'd probably need to clone myself, I think. There's a lot of work to do, and Edmonton and Alberta doesn't have the luxury of having all renewable power, so our operational emissions are still pretty significant. I mean, Embodied's very important to do as well too, but we need to tackle both of these problems at the same time. We were just looking at electricity map that Ryan mentioned before, and Alberta's live grid is at 477 grams per kilowatt hour right now. So things are getting better. I think the last national inventory report is sitting around 0.82, so it's pretty good progress in a short amount of time as they start to take these coal plants offline, replace them with natural gas. So we'll start to approach that 18 or 180 grams down there, and probably even less than that as we add more renewable energy to our grid as well too. But yeah, in terms of operational emissions, we'll keep it going down, switch over to our all electric systems, which will hurt us a little bit in the short term, just as the grid still has a relatively high emissions factor. We might see a slight uptick in GHG emissions, but it'll come down as we look forward to 2030. On the embodied carbon side, we still are just in the reporting phase as well too. I feel like my job is just catching up to Toronto and Vancouver all the time too, because they're doing such great work in this as well too, with the guidelines and the standards and the targets that they have as well too. So partnering with them, and I'm very grateful to be here to learn all the best practices and everything, so I can take it back and make, Edmonton keep up with the big kids or whatever, instead of just chasing them around the playground.
If you had only 1 year and politics and, user behavior aside, although I'd say that during COVID, many of us totally shifted our behaviors and our users, and commercial building occupancy has not returned to anything close to what it was before. And that could mean that one could maybe do much more commercial buildings in the country without underground excavation. A retail, that already happens, and that might happen more broadly. And that could totally change the approach to how you can do structure and enable much more timber and allow us to maybe move away from this, what I feel is kind of a false promise that low carbon concrete is going to take us out of that. I mean, really view that as the clean coal of construction, to say that we're going to still figure out a way to do it out of concrete. It's just going to be a little bit cleaner. That all the LCAs would show that you could still replace your high carbon concrete with low carbon concrete, and that concrete is still this monolithic beast of carbon in your embodied carbon world. Being more realistic, I just look at the Canadian context. Where I cut my teeth as an engineer was on a project called the Drake Landing Solar Community, which is a community in Alberta, 52 homes, all of them heated by the sun through this massive seasonal storage system where they collect solar thermal heat in the summer, pump it into this geothermal store during the summertime and use it in the wintertime. And that was a project heavily funded by the government, including private industry support, to try to see, this is now 20 years ago, how do you get to net zero energy? That's how long we've been dealing with net zero energy. And those types of projects are necessary for innovation, for spurring more ideas, to learn what we should and shouldn't do. And in fact, what we probably just deserve right now is a similar amount of investment that will require government support to get low, ultra low embodied carbon buildings, and to seed out from innovators the kind of typologies that are necessary. It's going to take more than a year, but frankly, if we don't have those types of pilot projects, we're likely missing a huge opportunity here to innovate, because it's hard for industry to do that without those types of risks. I mean, you're talking about taking massive architectural risks in layout and programming that really requires at least 1 or 2 pilots to be able to sort of see whether or not the communities are willing to go in this direction. And so my advocacy is more to government and policy and incentives to really incentivize embodied carbon directly, unitarily, solo, in absence of operating energy, just for a while.
If we're working for a large company and we're trying to tackle something like thinking through, how do I make my entire portfolio move over to net zero? One of the things that you would do is you would start with pilot projects. If we were to look at the city of Vancouver, the city of Toronto, and other cities across Canada that have signed on, made net zero commitments, and started going down this path, from what you have learned in research and playing out certain portions of it, what would you adopt and then implement and move forward? And then how would you then roll that out across the different cities across Canada to do it rapidly?
So it really varies context to context, as we just discussed. So for the city of Vancouver, we do know that electrification is a solution to both new buildings and existing buildings. So I think that by electrifying heating and hot water supply, we can reduce the GHG by 85 to 100%. So that is for the operational carbon. And then going to embodied carbon, I would say that we could focus on major emitting materials. Embodied carbon right now is similar to the early days of operational carbon. We have very many low-hanging fruits that we haven't even touched. So the reduction is possible, but first we need to make that. So the pilots, like you said, looking into setting a target for that project, identifying major contributors, and looking into alternatives. Definitely the industry, the suppliers need to catch up, but we have seen it with operational carbon. When you start with addressing the low-hanging fruits, the industry will innovate. So say, what we have learned as City of Vancouver is instead of providing prescriptive approach, especially for larger projects, is to set the target and let the industry innovate and remove the barriers for them. So we wouldn't say pick this material over that material, but when you have the target, you'll know that what materials are available to you and what can help you achieve that target.
Yeah, during our engagement with industry over the last 4 years, we've always looked at different mechanisms to achieve this goal of an emissions neutral new construction, and ultimately our long-term goal of having a completely emissions neutral city as well too. Alberta is unique. So, we have to try a couple different strategies as we went through our engagement. We wanted to set some sort of target to improve our buildings, whether it was improved energy efficiency targets, regulating or looking at setting limits for thermal demand intensity, like TEDI, as I think most people may be familiar with, or setting greenhouse gas limits as well too, such as in intensity. And the thing we've learned is that we can't regulate what's already being regulated. So since there's an energy code in Alberta, the City of Edmonton can't have their own energy code as well too. And with the new codes coming out, we can't regulate that thermal demand intensity because the National Building Code now says that you have to improve your envelope a certain percentage over the baseline as well too. So we looked at setting greenhouse gas targets, and we brought this up through our industry engagement. And the feedback we got is that regulation should be the last step that we try before looking at other avenues. So the approach we've been taking now is starting with education. So we have ZEBEX here, which is a great program, and launching in just a couple months in Alberta, we have the Emissions Neutral Building Exchange as well too. So it's run by Alberta Eco Trust. They're starting to roll this out and develop education programs so we can achieve this goal of emissions neutral buildings or higher performance buildings, which is really great to see. I think this is something that we wanted to do at the city for a long time, and now that there's actually funding and capacity to do it, it's really great, and I think it'll help industry out a lot. We try to do what we can within the city, but budgets change, and we only have so much capacity to do it ourselves too. So it's great to have these partners to fill in the gaps that we can't fill ourselves. So once we get through the education portion and share all this information on how to design these buildings, who can help and everything, we're looking at incentives on how to assist with the cost premium for an emissions neutral building. Like, there's no surprise. It costs more. You ask a bunch of different people, you're going to get a bunch of different answers. And if you ask, certain associations, maybe the number's a little higher. And if you ask certain consultants or some of our internal work, the number's a little lower. But there's a range to it, and we need to help with that. So again, we are also looking at performance-based targets instead of prescriptive items as well too. So we try to look at limits, and maybe we'll incentivize, certain greenhouse gas intensity at some point. And then if that becomes regulation or the minimum, we'll just always incentivize one tier up, just to encourage the leaders to keep going. And then on the back end, if the carrot doesn't work, bring out the stick, and that previous tier or previous target will become the base, and we'll just slowly move up until we reach our goal. And I think that's something that can be repeated in just about any jurisdiction. I think it's a great approach to, ease industry into it and still achieve our goals.
I'd only add, where we're seeing at the international level, there's progress at different states and countries. Denmark these purports or celebrates that they're the first country to establish embodied carbon standards and targets for all new buildings. And they're taking an approach that's come from kind of what we've learned from the operating carbon arena, setting performance-based targets and at least mandating reporting. So LCAs will have to be done, they'll have to be reported, and there's at least a target on a total embodied carbon for a building. And certainly we can, as we're seeing, it's not that difficult to start there. Setting the value of the target is one that's a tricky value, but one can set the value because the practice of LCA is evolving. It's not totally brand new, but more practices have that experience to do so.
We're speeding up the transition to net zero. You've learned from this process. You now are sending an email to the other cities within Canada, and you are telling them 3 things. You are first spreading your message that we need to reduce our carbon emissions by 50% by 2030. That's it. That's what we have to do, right? Next, you have 3 things that you can tell them. You already understand the pushback that you got when you implemented different policies, regulations, and we're working to change things. What's the 3 things that you have in your guidance email to them?
Sure. Okay, only 3. What I would say is that I think again, looking at successful cities on how they transition their building construction into near zero or zero emission building, the first thing is set a very clear path on the target, not only 2050, practical intermediate targets, and signal the industry where they're heading. That clarity with the time to adjust to it will create that capacity building, or will allow that capacity building. So I would basically go back to the same 3 things that we found to be most effective: clear signaling of the destination, building industry and government capacity, leading by example with their own building, and then supporting and learning from the leaders. So trying as much as we can to remove the barriers and create incentives for those that are trying the innovative approaches for the first time. One thing I would add to, I think Adam just said, that setting the absolute target is a challenge. One thing that I firmly believe in, and I think is shown to be successful, is don't wait until we have all the things we need, because that's never going to happen. When you start with an imperfect target, even if it's proven to be wrong in some years, that's why it's proven to be wrong. Because if you haven't said that, you wouldn't even know that's wrong. So again, I think waiting for the perfect moment when the industry is ready to start, that means we are not going to achieve those targets.
Yeah, and I think getting the right voices at the table throughout the entire process is really important, not just to get everybody's perspective. So we've included the utilities, we've included consultants, we've included people within the city, we've included every industry association in existence, just so we make sure that all the stakeholders are on board. And I think that's true everywhere across Canada as well too. It's really important to get those voices and just know what they're capable of and what challenges you might not even know about until you bring somebody like, our natural gas and our electricity utility to the table. And they're like, yeah, it's fine. 200 amp, all this extra electricity, no problem. And then, second thing is getting the buy-in from all of those people. Like, we had meetings every month for an hour and a half to 2 hours for a year straight, and they're long. They're a little bit draining sometimes. They're always interesting, and same thing with the follow-up after. But it's a good process, and I think we all settle on a goal that we can agree on for the majority of the time. And then the third thing is just keep going. Sometimes it feels like it's an impossible task, and there's resistance, and you have concerns and you have hurdles all the time too, but just taking that one down at a time and taking the little wins when you can, you'll get there eventually. The finish line's not some big thing where everybody's clapping. You'll just cross it one day and realize, hey, we actually did this.
I mean, I agree with all the suggestions. I can only name two. Well, I'll come up with a third one. But, reporting LCAs, I think we're seeing that as being kind of an international requirement to really, there's two things. One is not just the data and needing to know the LCA. I really feel that this idea that we're in the Wild West of calculation approaches, I mean, there's still a need for better LCA and assessments, more discussion about LCA methodology until we get to a point where we feel really comfortable with how we're assessing embodied carbon in buildings, and requiring that to be done more would be great. The second one, I don't think it would be necessarily that politically contentious, expediting permitting approval for buildings that in their proposals eschew concrete and deal primarily with lightweight timber. If we could accelerate the construction of those buildings, frankly, the embodied carbon is, as you're saying, like some solutions are low-hanging fruit. And getting rid of carbon and avoiding kind of mass timber and dealing with lightweight structures probably is already a lower embodied carbon building. We could accelerate those and incentivize industry knowing that those buildings do get accelerated if you want to get to construction much faster than others. Third one, fund more academic research projects. That would help me a lot. There's plenty of other ideas, but I think at least starting with LCAs and permitting approvals could be interesting for cities.
This morning, we learned that between the Net Zero Asset Manager Alliance, Net Zero Banking Alliance, and Net Zero Insurance Alliance, there's over $170 trillion committed to getting to net zero. Out of the net zero banks, we have BMO, CIBC, RBC, TD, Vancity, Scotiabank, HSBC, B of A. There's a lot of money out there, right? And they are all trying to move in the right direction. You have an unlimited amount of money in front of you, right? You have them, they're sitting here, right? What can they do to support you to make this move faster?
So one project that I worked on not too long ago as a basis based on all that work that we did for emissions neutral buildings was to take a typical code-built building today, run the life cycle cost of it, like for absolutely everything, your mortgage interest, your utilities, solar, your delivery charges, and all that too. Reading in Alberta electricity and natural gas bill is like an exercise in itself too. There are so many rate riders and all these little intricate things, but I was determined to fully include all the costs in this analysis. And then comparing that to what we determined was an emissions neutral building in 2030. So obviously the emissions neutral building costs more upfront, but when you compare the life cycle cost of the two, the emission neutral building is cheaper for the homeowner and more beneficial to them over the 12-year period that our association says is the typical time that somebody stays in a home, and as well as over a 25 or 30-year life cycle as well too. The issue, I guess, is that there's a little bit of a cost premium. So your month-to-month costs as a homeowner are slightly higher for an emissions neutral building. And when I heard about the green financing and preferred rates for, if we attempt a net zero ready building, maybe we can get lower financing. And the premium is very small over that. So if we can shave a % of interest, maybe a little bit more for going for these high performing homes, I think that could really just tip the scale to make this financially viable and more financially attractive to pursue for industry. And that could be the accelerator that we need to make this more a reality, just to really, money talks. And this is the way I think that it can help us drive these high performing buildings. I'm going to say something knowing that, my perspective on this whole embodied operating, and I'm making a very dogmatic pitch about this. I'm a trained energy modeler. I came through the training of energy efficiency, and net zero energy was the future, and things change.
We have had 20 years of rapid reductions in PV and wind prices. Around the time that 20 years ago, I remember the skepticism was like, we're never going to get to a future where we get to grid parity. And we hit it not on time, but even slightly earlier. Where I think we're at now, and we can discuss about kind of the Canadian history around renewable energy and our international leadership on this. We had the very first passive house in the world. The passive house standard uses a home in Saskatchewan, built in the 1970s during the oil crisis as a root of this. Canada at what point had different perspectives of leadership? I think if there's any reason to be dogmatic on embodied, I think we're well positioned to be the country that leads on low embodied carbon buildings, because we in fact have the resources to be able to do that from a material standpoint and have a great vested interest to actually support those industries that do so. So I would look at all that money and say, if we wanted to talk about real economic opportunity as well as real impact on the environment, to actually shift much more towards thinking holistically what low embodied carbon construction means in Canada would be a fantastic opportunity for the country and the very many banks of which I would love to see if these hundreds of trillions manifest themselves, but if they do, it would be fantastic for it to go in this industry, in my view, despite being an energy modeler and what that means for my trade. I think for the embodied carbon industry, it would be a fantastic area to invest in.
I think all great points. I'm probably going to repeat some. I would say investing on low carbon products. It will help the industry, it will create jobs, it will create low carbon buildings. So it can be investing on low embodied carbon buildings and also on manufacturers with low embodied carbon products. So those two will capture the embodied carbon, and then financing or basically invest on decarbonizing existing buildings. So the renovation of existing buildings, getting to high performance electric or heat pump, whatever, getting to that emissions back and then taking the benefit from that investment is another way to help the industry.
So we're 10 years in the future and we missed the target. It's a lot warmer, and the storms are worse, pollution's worse, and you're speaking to a 5-year-old, right? And the 5-year-old says to you, I don't understand, right? I don't understand. You had the ability to change things. You had the ability to change things. What have you done over the last 10 years? Why could you not change things, right? We sit here today and we understand that we've known about this problem. We've known about this problem for over 20 years. And people have made commitments, right? And yet we're not moving there fast enough. We don't have it under control, right? So what do we tell them in the next 10 years if we don't actually get there?
I'll look to the city planners for the answer to this one. I'm just a professor.
Definitely start with I'm sorry.
I mean, I have one. I mean, also we're living it too, right? I mean, you said 20 years. I came in at Inconvenient Truth. That was already 20 years after Kyoto. So we're in 40 to 50 years of this thing. And I think psychologically and for mental health, we're going to have to come to a time where we're going to see that these two things are happening in parallel. The climate is changing. I think the IPCC is going to announce that we're going to surpass 1. They're preparing us for the announcement that we're going to surpass 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that has a very harrowing perspective on Vancouver from a 1 in 1,000 year heat wave being a 1 in 50 year heat wave. And that's going to happen too. It's going to also change the calculus on decarbonization, because we're going to need to spend some of the $100 trillion into resiliency and climate resiliency at the same time in mitigation. I suspect, having a 6-year-old, that when she's 11, she's going to ask me this question. And I'm going to say, we are doing our best as humanity ever did, and we can only hope for the best. But it's going to be still so dependent on people outside this room. Political agency, all of that stuff, the politics of climate change, that's still a sort of perennial and never ending. And we can only hope through our advocacy that this becomes a much more national mission than it has been for 40 years. But unfortunately, I feel that we are going to be in a history repeating itself phase, because This has been the story of climate change since the 1970s, when this was first a formal issue on the government table.
Adding to that, I would say as the city, we have to be realistic about all the changes that are coming. So we are not only focusing on the climate mitigation, we are putting focus on climate adaptation. We are focusing on equity and how it impacts different communities. So as we are developing all these things and as we are trying to move as fast as possible, we should also be prepared for all the changes that are coming. So in our regulations, we are going to require cooling, we are going to require ventilation or air, so create spaces or dwellings that can be safe from all the overheating, air and noise that is going to come from these climate change impacts, and also look into communities that impacted maybe differently and do our best to minimize that as much as we are speeding up what we are doing.
Yeah, and I think it's a similar strategy that we have as well too. Just, good thing we had a plan B. We looked at adaptation. We did those climate risk assessments back in 2023, and we had mitigation strategies for overheating, for flooding, for high winds, for extra precipitation, for drought, and all those fun things that go into a climate risk assessment too. So we'll see if our plan actually worked, and then, we'll try harder. Sorry, kid. I agree.
We wanted to open it up to questions.
The question is more about your strategy around density, especially for homes going forward. Where is that in your strategy, assuming that would be obviously less materials, less carbon requirements overall?
Yeah, I think the one curse and blessing for Edmonton is that we're not bound by any water, we're not bound by mountains or anything like that. So we can just sprawl and sprawl and sprawl until we hit Calgary or, I guess, Red Deer first, depending which way you go. We're redoing our zoning bylaw right now to really encourage the missing middle, so looking more at townhouses, the multi-family walk-ups, and just trying to remove those zoning restrictions to encourage more infill within the city so we can use our existing services rather than servicing all these new neighborhoods with new water, new power, new fire stations, new schools, and all these things that are really expensive that are funded by property taxes. Nobody likes tax increases, but everybody loves living a 40-minute drive from downtown out in the suburbs as well too. So I think, just redoing those zoning laws to allow that higher density to offset the sprawl and encourage, using what we have rather than just adding more emissions, adding more embodied carbon in all these roadways and sidewalks and everything as well too. And we'll see what happens when it's done. I think engagement's wrapping up in the next few months, and then we'll see how it rolls out.
I would say very similarly, City of Vancouver also has looked into more flexibility on the single-family zone to allow multiplexes. So increase the density on those areas will create that possibility, more flexibility in the zoning through the rezoning to allow more density in certain neighborhoods. City of Vancouver Climate Emergency Action Plan had 6 big moves, as we call it, and the first 2 are related to neighborhoods. So first one is walkable neighborhoods, and the second one is active transportation. So for us to be able to achieve those, we need to have a certain density to our city to allow that accessibility.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.